To begin the series, we have Dr. Marguerite Johnson, now head of school, I believe, in elevated acting head of school.
For 4 weeks.
For 4 weeks. So if you've got any things that you want done, money.
Let me think about it.
So Dr. Marguerite Johnson has a prolific publishing record and very extensive interests in a whole range of things, as we can see from this particular talk, which is to do with both Newcastle and the influences of the classical world on Novocastrian architecture. This is being published as we speak in the Melbourne Historical Journal under the aegis of the Amphora series, and it will be out, is it available now?
Right now.
Right now. So, and we're also being recorded, so please laugh and clap at appropriate places so it looks like it's a well received paper. So here we have Dr. Marguerite Johnson, what to look for in a mayor, etc. Thank you.
Thanks, Jane. Well, before I start this paper, I should say that it actually is a paper that was written and inspired and came from the environment in which we're all sitting now. So I'm really glad that I'm delivering the paper in cultural collections, because the idea to do this partly came from Johnny DeGravio, my colleague and friend, who's the archivist here, when I came down and said, I've been asked to write this article, Johnny, it's 4,000 words, it's got to be on classical reception, I thought I'd do something to do with Newcastle, and Johnny just brought out an archive and said, what about Morris Light? And so, in fact, what to look for in a mayor is they're Johnny's words. So I have to acknowledge him, he gave me the title for the paper. And then Johnny and Greg were amazing as I went through the archives and did all sorts of stuff for me. So it's very appropriate that it's taking place here. Recent scholarship on the classical tradition, as it applies to the physical, architectural construction and features of nations, or more precisely cities, has become an increasing concern within the field of classical reception. Once the preserve of architectural historians, regularly, historically speaking, working without particular deference to historic cultural tenets, the legacy of antiquity on cityscapes is not only an emerging topic of endeavour among classicists, but also an important interdisciplinary adjunct to studies of demographies and the socio-economic dynamics of place. It is also a means by which scholars can explore dialogues of civic identity within the confines of city space, or indeed within geographical microcosms or enclaves within metropoles. While scholarship within classics per se is concerned with monumental themes and iconic cities, there is less attention on smaller urban centres, usually the preserve of archaeologists. We can speculate that this is the legacy of the grand narrative that has historically dominated classical studies, which reception studies has increasingly sought to destabilise, through research that involves at times sharper attention to topics concerning the dispossessed, the implications of race, and more recently, one area I'm interested in, not only race but class. This paper seeks to interact with the issues outlined above in order to contribute to research on the influences of the ancient world on later cityscapes. It is also concerned with a significant movement within classical reception studies to give voice to some of the non-traditional concerns of classicists, essentially, in this instance, the presence of the ancient world legacy in the most unlikely of places. Now, I can say the next bit because I'm a Novocastrian. One such place, an unlikely locale, is Newcastle, a city far removed from the cultural and historical grandeur of the super cities of Britain, Europe and North America, if cities are to be judged by, in this instance, the markers of classicism. Indeed, if we were to ponder the great cities of Australia, Newcastle would not readily come to mind. Refounded or rediscovered by colonists in 1797, Newcastle's reputation has not infrequently rested on several unfortunate stigmata. its convict beginnings, its coal mines and coal miners, the smog of its industrial centres, the Star Hotel riot, and an earthquake. Insightful here is the unfortunate quotation from Mark Twain, who during a speaking tour of the Antipodes in 1895 sought refuge in Newcastle only because he had an agonising toothache, only to leave it with this indelible goodbye quip, and I quote, "Newcastle is one long street with a graveyard at one end with no bodies in it, and a gentleman's club at the other with no gentleman in it." A similarly derisive tone is evoked by Harold Wells, who characterises Newcastle in the early 1900s as a thriving industrial centre, a dirty city, over which clouds of cold smoke lie low in the heavy air, in which coal dust and soot penetrate every home, colouring the household linen. A city of 150,000 people, mainly dependent for their livelihoods on the coal mines and the gigantic steelworks. In short, one may argue that Newcastle lacks, as Dr. Nancy Cushing keeps telling me, high culture, or it's perceived to lack high culture. What high culture is, of course, is a matter of debate. If, however, one were to use a cultural marker well known in the West and the fetish of the traditional classicist, namely some discernible debt to classical Greece and Rome, then one would have to rethink Newcastle's shortcoming in this respect. The not insubstantial markers of classicism that inscribe the urban body of Newcastle are the legacy of Alderman Morris Light. Johnny and Greg put up a poster. I think we have the original just out the back behind Greg's office on the wall. A Novocastrian by choice, not by birth, Light was born in Kovno, Western Russia, in circa 1859. A businessman, after moving to Scotland in order to escape the increasing persecution of the Jews in his homeland, Morris Light migrated to Australia in 1884 and moved to Newcastle in 1886. A businessman who began his mercantile trade by selling household items door to door from a horse and cart, Morris Light became a migrant success story, rising from humble beginnings to the august position of mayor in 1924. While his time in this office was brief, indeed lasting only till 1925, it was nevertheless long enough to leave a classically inspired imprint on the city. A town hall in the interwar academic classical style, and the Civic Theatre in the Georgian revival manner, with more than a smattering of lush Greco-Roman ornamentation. Light's vision for Newcastle was initially inspired by his mini grand tour of 1923. In a ramshackled scrapbook he collated, which is in archives, later editions by his son Bertram, he writes notes on his journey overseas, and this was what I spent time doing, reading this scrapbook, and which functions also as a diary, to put this together. And he talks about Durban, its town planning and public architecture. And Light was especially enamoured of Durban's town hall. I arrived in Durban, South Africa on the 7th of March and was very glad to land ashore. Since I left Fremantle, no land was sighted crossing the Indian Ocean. Durban is a beautiful city. It has a magnificent town hall, supposed to be one of the finest in the British Empire. It cost £350,000 to build. It is situated in the West Street, which is the principal street and is the heart of the city. It has an art gallery, library, museum. The hall, where mayoral functions and concerts are held, will seat 3,000 people. Light's interest in white South African architecture and town planning is of particular significance in relation to his visions for Newcastle. As William Dominic has discussed, and I quote, classical architecture, with its qualities of monumentality and historicism, emblematic of European colonial power and tradition, has influenced the design of numerous public buildings in South Africa. In terms of Durban and its town hall, which was completed in 1910, designed by Stanley Hudson, neoclassicism morphed into and merged with a neo-Baroque style, indicative of the more ostentatious examples of the inclination towards heaviness that characterised some Edwardian architecture. And I must say at this point, my knowledge of architecture has soared since writing this paper, and I want to thank Tessa Morrison, who is over in architecture, who talked me through so much of this. Durban's town hall, like the resultant one in Newcastle, was itself modelled on another, the town hall in Belfast. This cyclical deference to other cities, other designs and monuments is suggestive, in this instance, of the imperative behind architectural imitatio, to reference an established artefact to legitimate something, be it political, artistic, social or cultural in the broadest sense. We can posit, therefore, that such heavy-handed implementation of classically inspired architecture in countries such as South Africa and Australia often authenticated and legitimated these colonial outposts in terms of their place within empire. Buildings such as these helped in the partial creation of new versions of the mother country in order to forge symbolic allegiances to Britain and to mimic the alleged markers of her perceived cultural superiority. Morris Light, in this sense, was no different to town planners throughout the empire. A man of his time, he was searching for something better for his adopted city and saw that something in the landscape of a fellow colonial city, Durban. On his return to Newcastle, Light campaigned for renowned architect Henry Eli White to create an ambitious town hall which he intended to be part of a civic precinct that would incorporate a theatre and a shopping complex. So began Morris Light's odyssey of local government infighting and factional obstructions. It's amazing to read this stuff as the years limped by. Remnants of, edit that out, Marie. The plans were revised, they were rejected, they were revived, they were stalled and revived again. They were sabotaged, and on it went, and he just kept going. Ultimately, his will and his autocracy, which was awesome, prevailed, and the civic complex was officially opened in 1929. While Light did not live to see his buildings completed, his classical tastes made manifest in Newcastle, the town hall and the civic theatre remain a testimony to his vision and may well be regarded as testimony to, as Johnny DeGravio says, the qualities one should look for in a man. So this is an early postcard, around about 1930, and it shows a beautiful pictorial representation of Light's vision. The town hall bears features typical of the 20th century revival of neoclassicism, with its imposing Doric columns, stately entablatures on the lower level, and its two upper stories joined by Ionic columns. It is a building of gravitas, yet nevertheless one out of kilter with the more active and energetic architectural trends in the 1920s. So while there is this revolution in architecture for lightness and sort of streamlining, this heavy grey building is built in Newcastle. In addition to the entanglement of architectural periods evident in the main building, with the aforementioned Greco-Roman features combined with elements of a high Victorian era, such as heavy windows and a sweeping driveway, Newcastle's town hall also has a most extraordinary tower, Like the constituent parts of the whole that comprise the base of the town hall, the tower embraces yet another architectural design or trend that further adds to the eclecticism of the building. And this has caused immense excitement down here in cultural collections. When these original plans just appeared, as a lot of things down here do, someone comes in with a box of magical beauties and treats, and these are the original plans. That, how long, Greg? Not very long have been here, that caused immense excitement. And so I was really thrilled that the journal took and published these with the paper. So the architectural origins of the tower do not reflect a debt to Greece and Rome, but arguably to Egypt. Here is a tower that may be regarded as belonging to the Egyptian revivalist movement, a popular style in Europe and the United States, especially during the 19th century, although its origins are much earlier. So Egyptian revivalism can be seen around the Napoleonic era, but very popular during the 19th century. The style came to prominence during the 1920s as a result of archaeological forays of men such as Howard Carter, whose excavations and discoveries made all things Egyptian particularly fashionable. Admittedly, and Johnny and I have discussed this in detail, towers have emerged from stately buildings independently of Egyptian revivalism. Yet this particular tower, rising at this particular time, seems to add a conscious nod to Egypt, as much as its foundations acknowledge the classical world. It does so, stylistically speaking, because of its resemblance to the lighthouse of Pharos. One of the seven wonders of the world, this here envisaged by archaeologist Herman Thiersch in his 1909 monograph. This is not necessarily a fanciful suggestion when one considers not only the popularity of Egyptian revivalism during the 1920s, evident in houses built in Newcastle, which was another amazing thing that I found out, that people's houses have got sphinxes and Egyptian artefacts in the plasterwork around about the same time. Very Egyptian-based interiors. Some houses in Newcastle have these still preserved. But also when you think of the geography of Newcastle, it's a harbour settlement like Pharos, and a possible pun also on Morris Light's name. Indeed, in references to Light in local newspapers, he is sometimes referred to as the Light of Newcastle, illustrated in an article on him from 1925, and the heading says, Mayor Morris Light, the light that shines over Newcastle Council. In addition to the town hall, Morris Light regarded the Civic Theatre on Hunter Street as his greatest achievement. Also designed by White, the theatre is, in terms of scale, monumental. Essentially a two-storey Georgian revival building with Italian Renaissance elements, most prominent in its repetitive semicircular headed windows. The interior is Spanish Baroque, incorporates classical features including a proscenium arch adorned with a frieze and recessed arches over the royal boxes containing parapets with insets. Apollo is on one side and an elegant Grecian female, possibly a muse or one of the Graces, on the other side. And this paper has been the most amazing experience because not only was I dealing with Johnny and Greg and archives, but Nancy Cushing, our historian, helped me so much, then Tessa Morrison from architecture, and then it tops it off with Stuart Marlin, who is a lecturer in psychology, who had photographs of the inside of the building and gave them to me. So it's been very much a University of Newcastle paper. As with the references to the lighthouse in relation to the town hall, the statue of Apollo once again represents the motif of light in addition to his other traditional symbolism. rendering him an appropriate inclusion in the theatre. He stands somewhat awkwardly, no particular symmetry adorns his stance as one would usually expect, cradling his lyre in his right arm and saluting the audience with his left. The statue, as with its twin standing opposite, provides the sense of taste and culture, high culture, that was clearly a major imperative for the architect of this building as well as the interior designer of this building. And again, Morris Light went all out. Not only did he have this famous architect design the buildings and constantly rejected local architects to do it, but he employed the interior designer J.B. Rowe at great expense to do the decorations. These statues, unexpected settlers in Morris Light's Coalopolis, are nevertheless most welcome in his theatre. While clearly a suitable choice, quite possibly by Rowe, they also reflect Light's fascination with Greek artefacts and classical artefacts in general. This fascination, and indeed awe, that Morris Light had for the ancient world is evident from his travel journal. After he went to South Africa and saw the town hall in Durban, he went to England, and his journal contains these musings and reflections on this, local man walking into the British Museum. We visited the British Museum and were astounded at the vastness of the collection. The sculptures were very fine: Greek, Norman, Assyrian, Babylonian, Egyptian, vases of different nations and ages, mummies of all ages. The statues of different statesmen, very wonderful. In fact, it is very bewildering and impossible to describe the collection. It is absolutely the wonder of the world. Of relevance here, in terms of cultural contextualisation of Light's response to the grandeur of the British Museum, is the work of Mark Bradley on the British Museum and Imperialism, an amazing essay. And he says, this institution, I'm not sure if I call Bradley's, this institution, the British Museum, became a powerful expression of British hegemony over contemporary European claims to ownership of the classical past, as well as the currency of ancient artefacts for representing the cornucopia of the British Empire. The juxtaposition of Light's description of the museum and Bradley's reception-based analysis of what the British Museum meant at this time and still means may initially appear to be an excessively academic and by default a supercilious endeavour. I've plucked out Morris Light's musings on the museum, and as a classicist and an academic, then I'm comparing it to sort of Bradley's very sort of academic response, but I see them very much feeding into each other. Its purpose, however, is not only, as prefaced above, to contextualise Light's response within the cultural discourse of imperialism, but in turn to exemplify Mark Bradley's insightfully broad-based deconstruction of the museum by reference to a narrow, personalised, experiential response to its authority as a symbolic arbitrator of culture. Here is a migrant made good, a local government official, a soon-to-be mayor from an outpost city within a colonial outpost, experiencing the grandeur of the mother country firsthand. Here is a personal testimony to Mark Bradley's postmodern and post-colonial readings of what the museum meant. Light's vision was literally visionary, particularly in view of the Coalopolis Steel City's reputation as a place far from the elitism of and high culture associated with classicism in any form. It must be acknowledged that White was busy designing theatres in Sydney, also the Capitol Theatre and the State Theatre. At the same time, he was working on Newcastle's Civic Theatre, and that the results are strikingly similar. Nevertheless, it is equally important to consider that as some scholars on Newcastle have emphasised, deconstructing the identity of place exposes the ideologies and the actors behind such constructions. It is in this sense and in this instance that the ideology of the actor is important. Light, a performer in a script of his own composition, commissioned and intensely oversaw his architect in order to ensure that the classically inspired grandeur he experienced in Durban was played out in Newcastle. And it is this deconstruction of his markers on the city, in this instance, the Civic Theatre, that is unique. Light was a small player in a much bigger, indeed global arena. Nevertheless, his vision for his city was on a grand scale. It has been the intention of this paper, therefore, to bring light, pun intended, to his story, articulated through a classical lens, in order to stimulate further research on the part of scholars of reception studies into the minutiae of its discipline, into the forgotten archives of individuals who, despite the odds, fought to claim a piece of classicism for themselves and, in the case of Morris Light, for their city. Thank you.